After studying this module, you shall be able to know about the ethical and professional issues involved in psychological testing, understand the relevance of client welfare and maintaining client relationship, know the right way of maintaining interprofessional relationships, have the understanding of issues related to test security, interpretation and publication. Know about the ethics involved in research precautions, publication credit and promotional activities. Many ethical protocols, moral principles and professional standards and guidelines are required to be considered for psychological testing process. This is to ensure that the client's welfare is safeguarded on the one hand and on the other, professional obligations of a psychologist is duly met. This module details about the principles of psychological testing covering client relationship, impersonal services, interprofessional relations, remuneration, research precautions, publication credit and promotional activities. It also highlights issues and ethics related to security, interpretation and publication of a psychological test. The individuals taking a test have the right to be informed about the testing process. They should be clearly stated about the nature, the purpose, the implications and the results of the test score. They should be protected from any kinds of physical and mental trauma during the testing procedures. Test takers must be competent in administering, scoring and interpreting the test scores. Further, a psychologist must act with integrity in regard to colleagues in psychology and in other professions. He must respect the rights and reputation of the institute or organization with which he is associated. In establishing rates for professional services, the psychologist considers carefully both the ability of the client to meet the financial burden and the charges made by other professional persons engaged in comparable work. It is to be noted that these specific principles and research protocols are to be monitored carefully by the psychologists. Failure to adhere to these can have severe consequences for the scientists. Principles of psychological testing. The American Psychological Association has laid down several principles in the biographical directory of the American Psychological Association to ensure ethical and professional compliance with testing. These 19 principles are reproduced in this and the previous module for the students to make them explicable about the responsibilities of various stakeholders involved in testing process. The previous module talked about the first 6 principles. Principle 7, Client Welfare. The psychologist respects the integrity and protects the welfare of the person or group with whom he is working. The psychologist in industry, education and other situations in which conflicts of interest may arise among various parties as between management and labor or between the client and the employer of the psychologist defines for himself the nature and direction of his loyalties and responsibilities and keeps all parties informed of these commitments. When there is a conflict among professional workers, the psychologist is concerned primarily with the welfare of any client involved and only secondary with the interest of his own professional group. The psychologist attempts to terminate a clinical or consulting relationship when it is reasonably clear to the psychologist that the client is not benefiting from it. The psychologist who asks that an individual reveal personal information in the course of interviewing, testing or evaluation, or who allows such information to be divulged to him does so only after making certain that the responsible person is fully aware of the purpose of the interview, testing or evaluation and of the ways in which the information may be used. In cases involving referral, the responsibility of the psychologist for the welfare of the client continues until this responsibility is assumed by the professional person to whom the client is referred or until the relationship with the psychologist making the referral has been terminated by mutual agreement. In situations where referral consultation, or other changes in the conditions of the treatment are indicated and the client refuses referral, the psychologist carefully weighs the possible harm to the client, to himself, and to his profession that might ensue from continuing the relationship. The psychologist, who requires the taking of psychological tests for didactic classification or research purposes, protects the examinees by ensuring that the tests and the test results are used in a professional manner. When potentially disturbing subject matter is presented to students, it is discussed objectively and efforts are made to handle constructively any difficulties that arise. Care must be taken to ensure an appropriate setting for clinical work to protect both client and psychologist from actual or imputed harm and the profession from censure. In the use of accepted drugs for therapeutic purposes, special care needs to be exercised by the psychologist to assume himself that the collaborating physician provides suitable safeguards for the client. Principle 8. Client relationship. The psychologist informs his prospective client of the important aspects of the potential relationship that might affect the client's decision to enter the relationship. Aspects of the relationship that are likely to affect the client's decision include the recording of an interview, the use of interview material for training purposes, and observation of an interview by other persons. When the client is not competent to evaluate the situation, as in the case of a child, the person responsible for the client is informed of the circumstances which may influence the relationship. The psychologist does not normally enter into a professional relationship with members of his own family, intimate friends, close associates, or others whose welfare might be jeopardized by such a relationship. Principle 9. Impersonal service. Psychological services for the purpose of diagnosis, treatment, or personalized advice are provided only in the context of a professional relationship and are not given by means of public lectures or demonstrations, newspaper or magazine articles, radio or television programs, mail or similar media. The preparation of personal reports and recommendations based on test data secured solely by mail is unethical unless such appraisals are an integral part of a continuing client relationship with the company, as a result of which the consulting psychologist has intimate knowledge of the client's personal situation and can be assured thereby that his written appraisals will be adequate to the purpose and will be properly interpreted by the client. These reports must not be embellished with such detailed analysis of the subject's personality traits as would be appropriate only after intensive interviews with the subject. The reports must not make specific recommendations as to employment or placement of the subject which go beyond the psychologist's knowledge of the job requirements of the company. The reports must not purport to eliminate the company's need to carry on such other regular employment or personal practices as appraisal of the work history, checking of references, past performance in the company, and so on. Principle 10. Announcement of services. A psychologist adheres to professional rather than commercial standards in making known his availability for professional services. A psychologist does not directly solicit clients for individual diagnosis or therapy. Individuals' listings in telephone directories are limited to name, highest relevant degree, certification status, address, and telephone number. They may also include identification in a few words of the psychologist's major areas of practice, for example, child therapy, personal selection, industrial psychology, and so on. Agency listings are equally modest. Announcements of individual practice are limited to a simple statement of the name, highest relevant degree, certification or diploma status, address, telephone number, office hours, and a brief explanation of the types of services rendered. Announcements of agencies may list name of staff members with their qualifications. They conform in other particulars with the same standards as individual announcements, making certain that the true nature of the organization is apparent. A psychologist or an agency announcing non-clinical professional services may use brochures that are descriptive of the services rendered but not evaluative. They may be sent to professional persons, schools, business firms, government agencies, and other similar organizations. The use in a brochure of testimonials from satisfied users are unacceptable. The offer of a free trial of services is unacceptable if it operates to misrepresent in any way the nature or the efficacy of the services rendered by the psychologist. Claims that a psychologist has unique skills or unique devices not available to others in the profession are made only if the special efficacy of these unique skills or devices has been demonstrated by scientifically acceptable evidence. The psychologist must not encourage nor within his power even allow a client to have exaggerated ideas as to the efficacy of the services rendered. Claims made to clients about the efficacy of his services must not go beyond those which the psychologist would be willing to subject to professional scrutiny through publishing his results and his claims in a professional journal. Principle 11. Interpersonal relations. A psychologist acts with integrity in regard to colleagues in psychology and in other professions. Each member of the association cooperates with the duly constituted committee on scientific and professional ethics and conduct in the performance of its duties by responding to inquiries with reasonable promptness and completeness. A member taking longer than 30 days to respond to such inquiries shall have the burden of demonstrating that he acted with reasonable promptness. A psychologist does not normally offer professional services to a person receiving psychological assistance from another professional worker except by agreement with the other worker or after the termination of the client's relationship with the other professional worker. The welfare of clients and colleagues requires that psychologists in joint practice or corporate activities make an orderly and explicit arrangement regarding the conditions of their association and its possible termination. Psychologists who serve as employers of other psychologists have an obligation to make similar appropriate arrangements. Principle 12. Remuneration. Financial arrangements in professional practice are in accord with professional standards that safeguard the best interest of the client and the profession. In establishing rates for professional services, the psychologist considers carefully both the ability of the client to meet the financial burden and the charges made by other professional persons engaged in comparable work. He is willing to contribute a portion of his services to work for which he receives little or no financial return. No commission or rebate or any other form of remuneration is given or received for referral of clients for professional services. The psychologist in clinical or counseling practice does not use his relationships with clients to promote for personal gain or the profit of any agency, commercial enterprises of any kind. A psychologist does not accept a private fee or any other form of remuneration for professional work with a person who is entitled to his services through an institution or agency. The policies of a particular agency may make explicit provision for private work with its clients by members of its staff, and in such instances the client must be fully apprised of all policies affecting him. Principle 13. Test security. Psychological tests and other assessment devices, the value of which depends in part on the merit of the subject, are not reproduced or described in popular publications in ways that might invalidate the techniques. Access to such devices is limited to persons with professional interests who will safeguard their use. Sample items made up to resemble those of tests being discussed may be reproduced in popular articles and elsewhere, but scorable tests and actual test items are not reproduced except in professional publications. The psychologist is responsible for the control of psychological tests and other devices and procedures used for instruction when the values might be damaged by revealing to the general public their specific contents or underlying principles. Principle 14. Test interpretation. Test scores, like test materials, are released only to persons who are qualified interpreters and use them properly. Materials for reporting test scores to parents, or which are designed for self-appraisal purposes in schools, social agencies, or industry, are closely supervised by qualified psychologists or counselors with provisions for referring and counseling individuals when needed. Test results or other assessment data used for evaluation or classification are communicated to employers, relatives, or other appropriate persons in such a manner as to guard against misinterpretation or misuse. Usually, an interpretation of the test result rather than the scores is communicated. When test results are communicated directly to parents and students, they are accompanied by adequate interpretive aids or advice. Principle 15. Test publication. Psychological tests are offered for commercial publication only to publishers who present their tests in a professional way and distribute them only to qualified users. A test manual, technical handbook, or other suitable report on the test is provided, which describes the method of constructing and standardizing the test and summarizes the validation research. The populations for which the test has been developed and the purposes for which it is recommended are stated in the manual. Limitations upon the test's dependability and aspects of its validity on which research is lacking or incomplete are clearly stated. In particular, the manual contains a warning regarding the interpretations likely to be made that have not yet been substantiated by research. The catalogue and the manual indicate the training, the professional qualifications required for sound interpretation of the test. The test manual and supporting documents take into account the principles enunciated in the standards for educational and psychological tests. Test advertisements are factual and descriptive rather than emotional and persuasive. Principle 16. Research precautions. The psychologist assumes obligation for the welfare of his research subjects, both animal and human. The decision to undertake research should rest upon a considered judgment by the individual psychologist about how best to contribute to psychological science and to human welfare. The responsible psychologist weighs alternative directions in which personal energies and resources might be invested. Having made the decision to conduct research, psychologists must carry out their investigations with respect for the people who participate and with concern for their dignity and welfare. The principles that follow made explicit the investigator's responsibilities towards participants over the course of research, from the initial decision to pursue a study to the steps necessary to protect the confidentiality of the research data. The principles should be interpreted in terms of the context provided in the complete document offered as a supplement to these principles. In planning a study, the investigator has the personal responsibility to make a careful evaluation of its ethical acceptability, taking into account these principles for research with human beings. To the extent that this appraisal weighing scientific and humane values, suggests a deviation from any principle. The investigator incurs an increasingly serious obligation to seek ethical advice and to observe more stringent safeguards to protect the rights of the human research participants. Responsibility for the establishment and maintenance of acceptable ethical practice in research always remains with the individual investigator. The investigator is also responsible for the ethical treatment of research participants by collaborators, assistants, students, and employees, all of whom, however, incur parallel obligations. Ethical practices require the investigator to inform the participants of all features of the research that reasonably might be expected to influence the subject's willingness to participate and to explain all other aspects of the research about which the participant may require. Failure to make full disclosure given added emphasis to the investigator's abiding responsibility to protect the welfare and dignity of the research participant. Openness and honesty are essential characteristics of the relationship between the investigator and the research participant. When the methodological requirements of a study necessitate concealment or deception, the investigator is required to ensure the participant's understanding of the reasons for this action and to restore the quality of the relationship with the investigator. Ethical research practices require the investigator to respect the individual's freedom to decline to participate in research or to discontinue participation at any time. The obligation to protect this freedom requires special vigilance when the investigator is in a position of power over the participant. The decision to limit this freedom gives added emphasis to the investigator's abiding responsibility to protect the participant's dignity and welfare. Ethically acceptable research begins with the establishment of a clear and fair agreement between the investigator and the research participant that clarifies the responsibilities of each. The investigator has the obligation to honor all promises and commitments included in that agreement. An ethical investigator protects participants from physical and mental discomfort, harm, and danger. If the risk of such consequences exists, the investigator is required to inform the participant of that fact, secure consent before proceeding, and take all possible measures to minimize distress. A research procedure may not be used if it is likely to cause serious and lasting harm to participants. After the data are collected, ethical practices require the investigator to provide the participant with full clarification of the nature of the study and to remove any misconceptions that may have arisen. Where scientific or humane values justify delaying or withholding information, the investigation acquires a special responsibility to assure that there are no damaging consequences for the participant. Where research procedures may result in undesirable consequences for the participant, the investigator has the responsibility to detect and remove or correct these consequences, including, where relevant, long-term after effects. Information obtained about the research participants during the course of an investigation is confidential. When the possibility exists that others may access such information, ethical research practice requires that this possibility, together with the plans for protecting confidentiality, be explained to the participants as a part of the procedure for obtaining their informed consent. A psychologist using animals in research adheres to the provisions of the rules regarding animals drawn up by the Committee on Precautions and Standards in Animal Experimentation and adopted by the American Psychological Association. Investigations of human subjects using experimental drugs, for example, hallucinogens, psychedelic or similar substance, should be conducted only in such settings as clinics, hospitals or research facilities maintaining appropriate safeguards for the subjects. Principle 17. Publication credit. Major contributions of a professional character made by several persons to a common project are recognized by joint authorship. The experimenter or author who has made the principal contribution to a publication is identified as the first listed. Minor contribution of a professional character, extensive clerical or similar non-professional assistance and other minor contributions are acknowledged in footnotes or in an introductory statement. Acknowledgement through specific citations is made for unpublished as well as published material that has directly influenced the research or writing. A psychologist who compiles and edits for publication the contributions of other publishers, the symposium or report under the title of the committee or symposium with his own name appearing as chairman or editor among those of the other contributors or committee members. Principle 18. Responsibility towards organization. A psychologist respects the rights and reputation of the institute or organization with which he is associated. Materials prepared by a psychologist as a part of his regular work under specific direction of his organization are the property of that organization. Such materials are released for use or publication by a psychologist in accordance with the policies of authorization, assignment of credit and related matters which have been established by his organization. Other material resulting incidentally from activity supported by an agency and for which the psychologist rightly assumes individual responsibility is published with a disclaimer for any responsibility on the part of the supporting agency. Principle 19. Promotional activities. The psychologist associated with the development or promotion of psychological devices, books, or other products offered for commercial sale is responsible for ensuring that such devices, books, or products are presented in a professional and factual way. Claims regarding performance, benefits, or results are supported by scientifically acceptable evidence. The psychologist does not use professional journals for commercial exploitation of psychological products, and the psychologist editor guards against such misuse. The psychologist with a financial interest in the sale or use of a psychological product is sensitive to possible conflict of interest in his promotion of such products and avoids compromise of his professional responsibilities and objectives. These specific principles are to be kept in mind and the research protocols to be monitored carefully by the psychologist. Failure to adhere to these can have severe consequences for the scientist. However, there exists a group of psychologists who believe that there is no need for special ethical rules to govern psychological research. They think that the ethical questions do not always have precise and clear-cut answers. As Puhan rightly argued, measurement, as we all know, not only includes formal testing but also all other processes involved in coding a subjective response. In many experimental studies, measurement is often blended into the method of investigation. In a broad sense, therefore, measurement is a crucial component of description of variables. Unless a variable can be measured or known, it would be difficult to speak about it in a meaningful way. This is the meaning and importance of testing. Psychology has become the fashion. We argue against testing without fully understanding the implications of their opinion. In fact, the psychologists who are advocating against measurement have too narrow of concept of testing or measurement. These two positions discussed above are in two extremes. Somewhere between these two is a rational position recognizing that much of value is to be gained from behavioral research and that all interests must be protected in the process of reaping these benefits. Like most rules, the ethical rules that govern psychological research are subject to different interpretations in different contexts. There will never be precise answers to the ethical questions that arise in the context of psychological research. There can only be rational and informed individuals who make decisions about ethical matters according to their best judgment. Summary. It is the duty of all the stakeholders of psychological testing process to ensure ethical and professional compliance with testing. Ethical procedures and protocols need to be followed to avoid ignorance, misuse, and disuse of the test. The psychologist respects the integrity and protects the welfare of the person, group, colleagues with whom he is working. The psychologist informs his prospective client of the important aspect of the potential relationship that might affect the client's decision to enter the relationship. A psychologist adheres to professional rather than commercial standards in making known his availability for professional services. Financial arrangements in professional practice are in accord with professional standards that safeguard the best interest of the client and the profession. Test scores, like test materials, are released only to persons who are qualified interpreters and use them properly. Psychological tests are offered for commercial publication only to publishers who present their tests in a professional way and distribute them only to qualified users. The psychologist assumes obligations for the welfare of his research subjects, both animal and human. The decision to undertake research should rest upon a considered judgment by the individual psychologist about how to best contribute to psychological science and to human welfare.